I kept every receipt, not because I'm the kind of man who holds on to paper. I'm not. Ask anyone who's known me longer than a year and they'll tell you I throw things away before I should. Forget birthdays, lose parking stubs. But I kept those receipts. The ones from the hardware store, from the sporting goods place off Route 9, from the orthodontist's office when the insurance didn't cover the back molars. I kept them in a shoebox on the top shelf of my closet, behind a stack of flannel shirts I never wore anymore. I don't know why I kept them exactly. Maybe I knew somewhere underneath everything that one day I'd need proof. Proof that I was there. Proof that I showed up. Proof that I showed up. Proof that for 11 years I was the one. My name is Walter. But everyone's called me Walt my whole life, and I'm 58 years old, and I need to tell you something that happened to me. Something I've never said out loud to anyone except my brother, and even then only half of it, because the other half still sits in my chest like a stone. I can't quite cough up. I married my wife, I'll call her Lorraine, when I was 41. She was 39. She had a son named Kevin who was 9 at the time, and I want to be careful about how I describe Kevin because he was a child when this started, and children are not responsible for the adults who shaped them. I have to keep reminding myself of that, even now. Lorraine and I met through a mutual friend at a 4th of July cookout. She was standing near the cooler in a blue sundress, not talking to anyone, just watching the kids run through the sprinkler like she was somewhere else entirely. I handed her a soda and she said, "I wasn't expecting anyone to notice me." I said, "I've been watching you for 20 minutes. I was probably too honest for a first conversation, but she laughed and that was that. She told me about Kevin on our 3rd date. She was upfront about it, didn't hedge. She said, "He's the first thing. Everything else is second." I said I understood, and I meant it. I'm not the kind of man who says things he doesn't mean. At least not when I'm sober and the lights are on. Kevin's father, his biological father, had left when Kevin was 4. Just decided one morning from what I could piece together that being a dad was a different thing than he'd signed up for. He moved to Phoenix, started a new life, sent cards on Christmas that stopped coming around 2017. Kevin didn't talk about him much, but you could see it in the way he watched other men, watching to see if they'd stay. I made a decision before I even proposed to Lorraine. I decided I was going to be the one who stayed. Not because I wanted a medal, not because I needed Kevin to call me dad. I didn't need any of that. I just knew what it felt like to grow up in a house where your father was technically present but never actually there, and I was not going to be another version of that for this kid. Lorraine and I got married in October, small ceremony, her mom's backyard in Delaware. Kevin was the ring bearer. He wore a clip-on tie that kept slipping sideways, and at one point he came up to me before the ceremony started and said very seriously, "Walt, your shoelace is untied." That was the most he'd said to me directly in 6 months. I crouched down and tied it and said, "Good catch." He nodded like he'd done his job and walked away. That was our relationship in the early years. Functional. Careful. Respectful of distance. I didn't push. That's the thing I want you to understand. A lot of people in my position would have pushed, would have tried to force warmth, buy affection, overcompensate in ways that make kids uncomfortable and resentful. I'd read enough, talked to enough people, to know that you can't manufacture a relationship with a child who has been hurt by a man leaving. You just have to show up consistently and let time do what it does. So I showed up. I made breakfast on Saturday mornings, scrambled eggs and toast because that's what he told Lorraine he liked and she told me, and I filed it away. I went to his soccer games in weather that had no business being outside weather. I sat through 4 years of middle school band concerts where he played the trombone with the enthusiasm of someone serving a sentence. I drove him to his friend Tyler's house so many times I knew that route better than my own commute. When Kevin was 13, the braces conversation happened. His teeth were coming in crooked and the dentist referred us to an orthodontist. I remember Lorraine looking at the estimate and going quiet in that way she had when money was tight and she didn't want to say so directly. I said, "I've got it." She said, "Walt, that's." I said, "I've got it." And I did. $1,800 out of pocket because we'd hit the insurance cap. I didn't say a word about it to Kevin. Why would I? You don't hand a 13-year-old a bill and say, "Look what I did for you." That's not love. That's accounting. When he was 15, he wanted to do a summer baseball program up in Vermont. 2 weeks, intensive coaching, the kind of thing colleges look at. The program cost $4,000 plus travel. I won't pretend that wasn't a significant amount. It was. Lorraine and I were comfortable, but not flush. I was a project manager for a mid-size construction firm. She was a dental hygienist. We had a mortgage and 2 car payments and all the invisible costs of running a household. I told Kevin I thought it was a great opportunity and I'd make it work. He didn't say thank you. Not that day. He nodded and went back to his room. I went downstairs and moved some things around in the budget and made it work. I want to be fair to Lorraine here because this story is easy to flatten into something simple, and she wasn't simple. She was a good woman in a lot of ways. She was warm and funny when she was relaxed. She was a dedicated mother who genuinely wanted good things for Kevin. But she had something in her. I came to understand it slowly, over years, that made her keep a wall up between Kevin and me. Not consciously, I don't think. Not maliciously. But it was there. She'd never quite say it outright, but there were little signals. If Kevin and I had a moment, a real one, where something clicked between us, she'd find a way to redirect. If Kevin asked me something directly, she'd sometimes answer for him, pull him back into her orbit. She would say things like, "Kevin knows he can come to me for anything," with an emphasis on the me that was so slight you could convince yourself you imagined it. I think she was scared. That's my honest assessment, having had years to sit with it. She'd been left by one man, and she'd spent 5 years alone rebuilding herself and her son as a unit, a tight-sealed unit that didn't depend on anyone else. And then here comes this guy who keeps showing up and won't leave, and some part of her didn't know what to do with that. Some part of her kept waiting for the catch. She never fully let Kevin trust me. That's the part that cost the most. Kevin graduated from high school when he was 17, and I sat in those bleachers in June sun that could strip paint, and I clapped until my hands hurt. Lorraine cried. Kevin crossed the stage and looked at his mother and waved, and I felt the particular sensation of being peripheral, but I clapped anyway. I always clapped anyway. He went to a state university in Virginia on a partial athletic scholarship and some loans and help from us. Help from me, though it was never framed that way. His first year, he barely called home. Second year, same. I would ask Lorraine how he was doing and she'd tell me what she knew, which was more than she told me she knew, I eventually realized. They had their own channel of communication that I was adjacent to, never quite inside. I told myself this was normal. College kids pull away. It's healthy. He wasn't my biological son. I had no claim to a relationship. Whatever I had to earn. By his junior year of college, Kevin was 20 years old and he was starting to talk about the future. Graduate school, career, and he'd started dating someone, a young woman named. I'll just say she was from his program, I don't need to use her name. And Lorraine would light up when he talked about her. I was glad he was happy. And then one Saturday morning in March, Kevin was home for a long weekend and Lorraine was at work. And he came into the kitchen while I was making coffee. He sat down at the table without saying anything. I poured a cup and put it in front of him, which I'd been doing since he was about 14. He'd started drinking coffee young, which I always found funny. He looked at me and said, "I need to talk to you about something." I sat down across from him. He said, "I'm getting married." I said, "Okay." I waited. He said, "We're doing it in September. Small ceremony, her family's place in the Carolinas." And then he paused, and I could see something working in his face, something he'd rehearsed. He said, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to hear it the right way." I said I was listening. He said, "You've been around a long time, and you've done a lot. I know that. But when I think about who's going to be there, who's standing up there with me, I keep coming back to the fact that you're not my dad. And I don't want it to feel fake. I don't want to have a moment up there that isn't real. So I think it's better if you just come as a guest, if you come at all. I want to describe what that felt like, and I'm going to try, but I want you to know that the words are going to fall short. It felt like the floor had been there my whole life, and then simply wasn't. Not the anger you might expect. Not the explosion. I've never been a man who explodes. Something quieter and more total than anger. Like when you've been holding something very heavy for a very long time and your arms just open. Not because you gave up. Because the weight was always yours and it's just now becoming visible to both of you. I looked at Kevin for a long moment. 20 years old. The same kid who once came and told me my shoelace was untied because he thought it was his job to look out for me a little, even when he wasn't sure he liked me. I had paid for his teeth. I had driven to Vermont in a rented minivan in July heat. I had sat in every bleacher, every gym, every auditorium. And here he was at my kitchen table drinking coffee I had poured for him, telling me I was optional. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I said very quietly, "I heard you." And I got up and went upstairs. Lorraine came home 2 hours later. I heard them talking in the kitchen for a long time, their voices low. She came up to find me. She sat on the edge of the bed and she said, "Walt, he didn't mean." I said, "Did you know he was going to say that?" She didn't answer right away. That was the answer. I said, "How long have you known?" She said, "He mentioned it to me last month. I told him it was his decision." His mentioned it to me last month. I told him it was his decision. His, that was what she said. As if the only person in that equation was Kevin. As if I was a variable he got to choose whether to include. I looked at her, my wife, the woman I had built a life alongside for 11 years, and I understood something then that I think I had been carefully not understanding for a very long time. She had let this happen, not because she didn't care about me. I think she did, in her way, but when it came to the moment, when it came to the choice, she had stepped back and let her son draw a line around their family and leave me on the outside of it. And she had called it his decision. I said, "Okay." She said, "Okay." I said, "I need a few days." I drove to my brother's place in Pennsylvania that afternoon. I didn't take much. I told Lorraine I needed space to think and I'd be back Sunday. I sat in my brother's kitchen for 3 days eating diner food and not sleeping well and talking it through, around and sideways. My brother, who has never been shy about saying what he thinks, said, "You've been a ghost in that house for 11 years and you know it." I said, "That's not fair." He said, "Walt, I love you, but you kept giving and kept hoping and never once asked for anything back. And now you're surprised it turned out like this?" I wasn't surprised exactly. That was the worst part. I drove home Sunday evening. Lorraine was in the living room. Kevin had gone back to school. I sat down and she looked at me like she was bracing for something. I said, "I'm not going to the wedding." She said, "Walt?" I said, "Not because I'm making a statement, not because I'm punishing anyone. I'm not going because I think Kevin told me something true and I need to respect it. He doesn't see me as family, and I'm not going to put on a suit and smile in photographs for a relationship that only exists in my own head." She started to cry. I had not often seen Lorraine cry. It hit me somewhere deep, the way it always did. But I kept going. I said, "I have been here for 11 years, Lorraine. I paid for those braces. I drove to Vermont in the middle of a July heat advisory. I sat in the rain at a soccer field in October for a kid who would not look at me from the field, not once, not to wave, not to acknowledge I was there. And I did all of that without asking for a thank you, without keeping score, without ever once saying to him, 'You owe me,' because that's not why I did it." She said, "I know." I said, "But somewhere in there, you had a chance to say to your son, 'That man loves you, let him in.' And you didn't. You kept the door open just enough that I kept believing it would widen, and it never did." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't know how." And that was the truest thing she had said to me in years. I believe her, even now. I believe she didn't know how. I believe she didn't know how. She was carrying something from before me. Something with deep roots that neither of us was equipped to dig out without help. I wish we'd gotten help. I wish I had pushed for it earlier. That's the thing I carry, not that she was a bad person, but that I waited too long to name what was wrong, and by the time I could see it clearly, the shape of our life was already set. We separated 8 months later. Not dramatically. No screaming. We did it the way two people do it when they're tired and sad and still fundamentally decent to each other. She kept the house. I got an apartment 20 minutes away, first floor, small yard, which suited me fine. I didn't go to Kevin's wedding. I sent a card. Just a card, no gift, because I was done performing generosity for an audience that had decided I wasn't part of the show. In the card I wrote 3 sentences. I told him I wished him well. I told him I hoped his marriage was built on honesty, and I told him that the door on my end would always be open if he ever wanted to walk through it. I didn't hear anything back. For 2 years I heard nothing. I went about my life. I settled into the apartment, got used to the quiet, took up woodworking on weekends, which sounds like a cliché for a man my age, and maybe it is. My brother visited when he could. I was not miserable. I want to say that plainly. I was not a man undone, but there was something unresolved in me. Not anger, not even grief exactly. Just a loose thread I couldn't quite find the end of. Then on a Tuesday morning in April, 2 years and 3 months after Kevin's wedding, my phone buzzed. A text from a number I still had in my contacts under his name. It said, "Walt. I know this is out of nowhere. I've been thinking about something for a while. Would you be willing to meet for coffee sometime? Just to talk. I understand if the answer is no." I sat with that text for a long time. I'm not going to pretend I didn't feel something. Something opened up that I'd been keeping carefully closed, the way you keep a window closed in winter, not because you don't want the air, but because you know the cold comes with it. I texted back, "Yes, you picked the place." We met at a diner about halfway between where we each lived on a Saturday morning. I got there first. I ordered coffee and sat in a booth and watched the door. He looked older, obviously. It had been over 2 years plus the years before that when I wasn't seeing him regularly. He had a beard now, which was new. He walked in, saw me, and something crossed his face that I recognized as relief, which surprised me because I hadn't thought about what he might be feeling, only what I was. He sat down. The waitress poured his coffee automatically the way they do. For a while neither of us said anything, and that was all right. We'd never been people who needed to fill every silence. He said, "I want to start by saying something, and I need you to just let me get through it before you respond." I nodded. He said, "I've been in therapy for about a year." He paused. My wife actually pushed me toward it. She said she felt like there was something I was carrying that I wouldn't let her near, and she was right. Another pause. My therapist helped me understand some things about how I grew up and the story I was told, not in words, but in the way things were structured, about who was safe and who wasn't, about what family meant. He looked at his coffee cup. I was told, not in words, that you were temporary, that you were adjacent, that the real circle was me and my mom and anyone else was outside it. I didn't say anything. I was listening. He said, "I was 20 years old, Walt, and I was repeating a story I'd been given. I'm not saying that to excuse it. I'm saying it because I need you to know I understand now where it came from." He finally looked up at me directly. "What I said to you that morning in the kitchen, there's not a word for how wrong that was. I know what you paid for. I know what you drove to. I know you sat in rain and heat and bad gym lighting for a kid who wouldn't even look at you from the field." His voice got rough around the edges there. I knew. I always knew. I just didn't know what to do with it. I took a breath. I said, "Kevin, can I ask you something?" He said yes. I said, "Did your mom know that you knew, that you were aware of what I was doing, even when you didn't show it?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think she knew I was starting to feel something toward you when I was around 15, 16. And I think that scared her. And I don't think she did it on purpose. But she would say things sometimes that made me pull back. Not big things, small things." I nodded slowly. That confirmed something I had suspected for a long time. Not to be right. There was no satisfaction in being right about this, just the weary recognition of a pattern finally named. I said, "Your mother was dealing with things that had nothing to do with you, and nothing to do with me. She carried something from before I ever met her, and she never got help for it, and it cost all 3 of us." Kevin looked at me for a long moment and said, "Are you really not angry?" I said, "I was, for a while, but anger takes energy. And I decided a long time ago to spend my energy on things I can actually build. He asked me then, quietly, like he wasn't sure he had the right to, whether I would consider being part of his life going forward. Not to pretend the past didn't happen, not to perform something, just if there was room, if I was willing to try. I thought about that shoebox in my old closet, the receipts, the orthodontist, Vermont, October rain, 3 sentences in a card that took me an hour to write. I thought about the man I decided to be before I even proposed to his mother. The decision I made in my own chest, before anyone asked me to make it. I showed up because of who I was, not because of what I'd get back. And that was still true. It was still true even now, even after all of it. I said, I'm not going to pretend any of this was okay. It wasn't. And I'm not going to act like we start from zero, because we don't. There's 11 years of history between us, and some of it was good, and some of it was good, and quote, and all of it was real. He nodded. I said, but I'm not a man who closes doors. That's not who I am. So yes, if you want to try, I'm willing to try. We sat in that diner for 2 more hours. The coffee kept coming. We talked about his wife, about his work, about small things. At one point he asked me about the woodworking, and I pulled up a photo on my phone of a side table I'd finished in February, and he said, "Walt, that's actually really good," with genuine surprise in his voice, and I laughed. Actually laughed for the first time in what felt like a very long time. When we walked out to the parking lot, he stopped and turned to me and said, "I should have said this a long time ago. Thank you. For all of it. For showing up when you didn't have to." I shook his hand, then I pulled him in and held onto him for a moment, the way I had wanted to for 20 years and never quite let myself. I let go and I said, "Go home to your wife." He nodded. He got in his car. I stood there in the parking lot for a while after he drove away, in that ordinary Tuesday morning light, and I thought about the shoebox. I went home that evening and I took it off the shelf, and I carried it out to the recycling bin, and I let it go. Not because what was in it didn't matter, because I didn't need the proof anymore. I never needed the title. I never needed the credit. I needed to know that it was real, that the years were real, that the decision I made in my own chest was worth making. And standing in that parking lot, watching his car turn out of sight, I knew it was real. It always had been. I've thought a lot about what made Kevin say what he said that morning. Not to assign blame. I'm past that. But because I think it matters to understand the mechanics of it. He didn't wake up one day and decide to be cruel. He repeated a story he'd been handed in small pieces over years by someone who loved him but was too afraid to love anyone else fully. And that's not an excuse, it's a cause, and causes matter if you actually want to understand what happened, rather than just feel righteous about it. Here's what I know about how people become who they are. They become it slowly, through accumulation. Kevin didn't decide at 20 that I was peripheral. He was told, in 100 small signals across a childhood, that the circle was tight and I was outside it. Kids absorb what they're given. They don't audit it. They just carry it forward until something, therapy, a good partner, the particular weight of their own regret, forces them to open the bag and look at what's inside. What I also know is this: the way you respond to being hurt either opens something in you or closes it. I've watched men let a wound like this calcify into bitterness, and I understand the temptation. There's a version of me that could have driven away from that diner 2 years later, could have shaken Kevin's hand and walked out and never looked back, and called it self-respect. It would have looked like strength from the outside. But I know what it actually is when a man does that. It's fear wearing a hard face. It's the decision to stop being someone who builds because building got painful. I chose differently. Not because I'm exceptional. I'm not. I'm a project manager from Delaware who makes decent scrambled eggs and builds furniture on weekends. But I decided a long time ago, before Kevin, before Lorraine, that the kind of man I was going to be was the kind who keeps showing up, not because showing up always gets rewarded. Clearly it doesn't. But because the alternative is becoming someone who stopped trying. And I've met those men and they are not at peace. They are just offended. What Rain and I didn't do, what I wish we had done, may be the most honest regret I carry, is sit down early and say, there is something broken between us that we cannot fix alone. She had wounds she never named. I had patience I mistook for wisdom. We circled each other for 11 years and called it a marriage and never once asked for help. That cost us. That cost Kevin too, more than he probably knows yet. The damage that parents carry quietly doesn't disappear. It just finds a new shape in the next generation. The thing about living with integrity, and I mean that in the plain, structural sense, the way a building has integrity, meaning it holds together under pressure, is that it doesn't protect you from being hurt. It just means that when you're on the other side of it, you can look at yourself clearly. I sat in that parking lot after Kevin drove away and I felt something I didn't expect. Not vindication, not relief exactly, but a kind of stillness. The receipts in the shoebox didn't matter anymore because the accounting was done not by me, but by time and honesty and a young man who finally opened the bag and looked inside. I don't know what the next years will look like with Kevin. We're taking it slowly. That's the only honest way to do it. But I know who I am on my end of it. I know what I showed up as, for 11 years without an audience. And I know what I'll keep showing up as. Not because he owes me, not because Lorraine will ever fully understand what she let happen, but because that's the man I decided to be in my own chest before anyone asked me to decide anything at all. That decision was always mine, and no one ever got to take it back.